I'm going to touch on a very sensitive topic, I think, for this community. It's also a sensitive topic for myself as a Peruvian of Quechua Andean lineage, which is the historical trauma of colonization and why we should be thinking about this in the psychedelic community. So we know that there's a huge interest in psychedelics, which is growing very rapidly, and many of these medicines come from indigenous cultures from countries that have been previously colonized, and I think that's very important to highlight. So what happens when we take the medicines from these countries, but ignore the whole historical, cultural, and medical model under which these medicines have been sustained, developed, and are still used in these traditions? So I'm arguing that without that historical and cultural awareness, we risk perpetuating colonial patterns, and I will explain why. So first, let's talk about what is historical trauma of colonization. It's a collective, it's a form of collective intergenerational trauma that affects a group of people who are systematically oppressed, colonized, subject to genocide, to forced assimilation. It's a trauma that is not a one single event. It's a long history of injustice, of violence, of cultural eradication. So in the case of Peru, because I'm from Peru, so I'm going to talk about Peru. We were colonized for roughly 300 years by Spain. We had been independent since 1821, so 200 years. So we've been colonized for longer than being independent. So you could ask, why are we talking about the historical trauma of colonization if the event ended 200 years ago? And yet, what research is showing that such a huge history, huge event in the history of a country, of a culture, doesn't end when a country acquires independence, or it's actually passed down the family system. It's even institutionalized in the structures, in the new political structures that are after colonization. So what is the impact of the historical trauma? So this is what has been described as the historical trauma response, which is a set of emotions, a series of emotions and actions in reaction to the trauma. It could include anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, violence, internalization of ancestral suffering, and historical unresolved grief. And I'm talking about on the descendants of the people who actually lived through colonization, obviously. I'm not talking about 200 years ago. I'm talking about people now. And this is, most of the research comes from the US, that what they have done with the Native American community, of what they are observing. A lot of this has been linked as well to the fact that many of these communities are now with higher rates of mental disorder, physical disorder, drug abuse, and so forth. So studies show that the perceived historical losses, what I mean by that is the losses of land, the losses of culture, of language, of history, have been linked to certain specific emotions that are being triggered on the descendants of the people who have gone through the actual historical process of colonization. And this series of emotions can include rage, anger, sadness, distrust of the white man, uncomfortable around white people. So in the case of Peru, like I mentioned, we were colonized by Spain for roughly 300 years. So it was a huge disruption, destruction of the culture at the moment, which was the Inca culture. There were many indigenous languages that were lost. When the Spanish arrived, we had roughly 300, some people say 700 indigenous languages. Right now, we have recognized 47 indigenous languages, and many are still in danger and disappearing. There was a huge imposition of a new worldview. Many of the pre-Columbian cultures, so the cultures, before Christopher Columbus arrived, they were animistic in nature. They were connected to, they were very connected to nature, if some of you maybe have experienced shamanic rituals, you would see that the shamans relate to the medicines as having a spirit, as everything is alive, and they communicate with the spirit of the plants, of the mountains, of the rivers. So this was a complete different shift when the colonizers came and brought a very different worldview, a very different set of principles under Christianity, a whole new set of values of how we were supposed to live our lives. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that colonization was not just a physical warfare, it was actually a psychological warfare, where the colonized people had to adopt a new set of values in order to survive throughout that period. There was a new racial and cultural hierarchy that was formed, where obviously indigenous people were at the bottom. They were primitive. They had to be, saved through Christianity. There were even debates whether indigenous people have a soul, which was very important for Spain at that time, because they had to make sure they could be saved through and go to heaven. So now I'm going to talk about transactional analysis, which is a psychotherapeutic model that we use. Maybe if there are some psychotherapists in the room, you are familiar with this model. It's a model that we use in one-to-one therapy, but I'm using this model to explain how, I'm applying it to colonization, to explain how a whole new set of values can be passed from generation to generation and still be present today. So first, to explain to you what transactional analysis is, for the ones who are not familiar, it's a method of understanding human behavior and social interaction. It's a model that was designed by Eric Berne, who was a psychiatrist in the 1950s. And based on transactional analysis, the human psyche is divided in three ego states, what we call parent, adult, and child. So we use any of these states when we have an internal communication within ourselves or an external communication with someone outside ourselves. So we can be in any of these states at a given moment, and we can switch from one state to another. So we are in the parent state when we are communicating what we've been taught, generally by our parents or our authority figures, our core set of beliefs, our values. Just to give you an example, because I'm glancing very quickly through transactional analysis, so I could explain the rest. If you have the set of value that to be successful, you have to get good grades, then maybe when you are doing an exam, you're having an internal dialogue that you better pass the exam because otherwise you won't be successful in life. So you have a core belief that success is linked to achievement. For example, okay, this is an individual at individual level. You are in the adult state. This is much more simple when you are in the present, using your logical mind, collecting data. For example, you are thinking about making a shopping list and communicating that within yourself or others. You are in your child state when this is more linked to the inner child and all the archaic emotions that we hold. So we are in that state when we are probably communicating or behaving very spontaneously, very playful, very open. We are able to be free with ourselves. Or we could be also very fearful, very restrictive if we have been told that to express emotions is not okay, or that children or men should never cry, or things like that. So, like I said, I'm using this model to explain how during colonization we could pass core beliefs from generation to generation. So what I'm arguing is that colonization was actually a model of reparentalization, because what transactional analysis teaches us is that whole set of beliefs that we internalize as our own parent in our psyche comes from the way we've been raised. And then even if our parents are gone, we may still sustain those same core beliefs and tell ourselves, each other, that same story as we've been raised. So during colonization, when we had to, the colonizers basically became like the new parents. So they taught us what we have to believe, what language we have to speak, how we have to behave, what we have to do in order to go to heaven or not. So it was a whole reparentalization process of how we were supposed to live our lives. When such a process happened, it is not so easy to erase it from the psyche of a community, and in this case, even of a country or a whole continent, because it's huge, after generations after generations. So another message from transactional analysis is that we talk about 12 injunctions. Injunctions are deep messages that we adopt as unconscious messages that shapes the child's belief about themselves and about the world, okay? I'm talking about the child because generally this is used for individual therapy. So in the case of, there are 12 of these injunctions that are really listed in transactional analysis, which ones they are. I think there are two, so I have chosen two that apply to colonization. And the first one is, don't be yourself. This is an injunction that can happen, for example, when a parent says to a child, be like your sister, or look, do like your brother, why are you like this? So in case of colonization, it was, don't be indigenous. Don't speak your language, don't practice your culture, your rituals, your way of thinking, don't be yourself. And that was really ingrained in the psyche of the people. The other, so basically reject your culture and tradition. The other injunction, the other deep message is don't exist. And this is quite deep. It's something that can happen when a parent says to a child, I wish you were not born, which is quite deep, traumatizing for an individual. So this is almost as you don't count, you don't exist, you don't matter. There are some sociologists in Peru, and I think in Latin America as well, that would argue that the independence never benefited the native people, that it only benefited the descendants of the Spanish. Because the native people and the indigenous people never had power, never had political and economical power. So therefore, with this context, I want to mention as well what we call life script, which is another narrative, or it's another concept from transactional analysis when we create our own narrative of plan in life based on the way that we have been raised. So I'm arguing that the life script that got formed in these countries after colonization was follow the colonizers' Western way of life, ignore your indigenous model, is primitive, is sinful, is obsolete. So we have basically internalized the colonizer's voice, and this is what is called endo-racism. So we don't need anymore an external force to tell us that we need to reject our own culture. We do it ourselves. There is some shame about practicing indigenous traditions, shame about speaking the cultures, and we try to pull away from that. So it is no surprise that in this context, the communities that hold this ancestral wisdom, teacher plants and psychedelics, what we're talking about, are often the most marginalized, discriminated, and the poorer in their own countries. So that just shows how much value we are still giving in these societies to these traditions and these people. I have a quote here from the president of Peru. He was president 2 times, the last time from 2006 to 2011, I think. And he's saying, we need to defeat the absurd pantheistic ideologies that believe that air is God. And the return to those primitive forms of religiosity where it says, do not touch the hill because it's an apu. An apu is a sacred mountain in Quechua language. So basically he's saying we should stop all this, because if we think that everything is sacred, everything has a spirit, we cannot do mining, we cannot progress, we cannot bring the companies here and do whatever we want with the land. So he says we need more education. The fact that we are progressing does not mean that our archaic forms of thought have been overcome. So we still live in this mentality of these are primitive, archaic forms that we need to overcome, because otherwise we cannot progress. This is from 2006 and 2011, okay? So what happens when in this whole context, now the West, comes, suddenly there is a psychedelic renaissance, as we call it here, and they're all interested in ayahuasca, wachuma, mushrooms, and everything. And we decide to take these, treat these medicines offered just as a technique, as a tool, and we forget the whole cultural, historical, and medical background, which a lot of it has still survived in spite of all this, colonization, and in spite of all the difficulties that many of these indigenous people have to go through in their own countries. So what I'm arguing is that if we don't treat that indigenous wisdom as equal, we are still perpetuating a similar mindset as during colonization. In countries where that's still, that inferiority of race is still present. So I would say there are two ways of learning. There are two different sciences. One is Western science, which is very much linked to understanding through the mind, mental processes, and the other one is indigenous science, which is experiencing with the body and the senses. I don't think one is better than the other. I think that both have its place, and actually a lot could happen if they learn to collaborate. So, not recognizing indigenous knowledge as equally valid reinforces the historical trauma of colonization and the narrative of inferiority which is still present in these societies. It reinforces the colonial mindset of follow Western science, ignore your own science, which is happening. That's why indigenous people, have a lot of trouble in these countries. So what I wanted to tell you here is that I am not speaking here right now only on behalf of native indigenous people that still speak, Shipibo, Quechua, or whatever. I'm here speaking to you in the name of every Peruvian. And even Latin America, because this sort of problem that we have, this division that we have in the country, because we haven't been able to integrate all the parts of ourselves, we are still in denial of certain part of our own identity, is affecting the whole country. It's dividing the whole country. It creates political tension. It creates social issues, and that affects the society as a whole. So what I would propose is a decolonial psychedelic future when we treat indigenous knowledge as equal, where they can be able to sit at the table and collaborate and give their perspective, where we can learn to communicate with each other, when we can co-create together, because we have a lot to learn from each other. And that requires humility, that requires ability to listen, to have this real collaboration. So I think this is an opportunity for the West to participate in this collective healing of historical trauma. And I will make a parenthesis here because, and I have a little bit of time, so I'm gonna throw a different idea, but because I've been talking about historical trauma of colonization from the colonized point of view. But we could talk about historical trauma of colonization from the colonizer's point of view, meaning the same way that when a father maybe abuses a child and the child has a trauma, the father also had a trauma for doing such a thing. So what is it that makes a culture or a country or an empire believe that they can go somewhere else and colonize people and go through this process? What were they trying to really negate in their own culture? And has that process really ended? What was it that the West was trying really to annihilate? Because when we go and colonize other people and disrupt something, it's because we have done it to ourselves first. So sometimes I even say Peru was colonized 300 years, but Europe has been colonized for longer. And here I'm talking about more the patriarchal model, okay? Because I think that's what we were colonized of, and we were trying to destroy in other cultures. Because these traditions, indigenous science, is feminine in nature. I'm talking about intuition, I'm talking about family, community. So it's a whole different set of principles. So we could look at it that actually contributing to this historical trauma, we are all healing. It's not just healing the indigenous people. It's not just healing, Latin America. We are all healing, and actually we all need that healing. So the main question is not only to what extent we have overcome the effects of colonization, but whether we have truly ended a colonizing mindset within ourselves. So are you able to treat a people of color as equal, not just because they think, they behave, or they believe as you do, but you're able to treat as equal their values, their culture, their principles, their science? Because for me, that's really equality, and that's really integrating ourselves at all levels. So this is this was part of my research for my master's, which was published in Spain, and I was very happy it was published in Spain. So the paper is in Spanish, and I'm sharing the link. If you want to have a look, or if you want a version in English, I can send it to you. Also now, we can translate with ChatGPT and everything. So thank you very much. Here are my details, Instagram and everything, if you want to contact me.